Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the VSI webinar series. Last week, Tom Sears spoke to David Allen, former executive from UFC, Nike, and Adidas, about innovations in the world of sport. Today, Tom will be speaking with David around his passion for the business of sport and how global sporting market is expanding to offer professional opportunities that maybe you are not aware of. Before we get into the interview, Tim Coates will explain how the delegates listening on the platform can pose questions to David post the interview. Tim?
Thanks, Tony. So, guys, if you're lucky enough to be participants on here, just enter your questions in the chat box at the bottom. There's a little icon there. If you can type them in there, we will answer. We'll pick a couple of them to ask a little bit later on at the end of the interview. So without further ado, because we're running 2 minutes slightly a pair, I'm going to pass you over to the most amazing Mr. Sears, who's going to take us through the next 30, 40 minutes with the amazing Mr. Allen. Over to you, sir.
Thanks, Tim, and afternoon, everybody. Hope you all had a good Easter and are all safe and well. David, welcome again. It was great to talk to you last week about your career, touching on innovation in sport and tech in sport. We'd like to delve a little bit deeper into your career progression and some of the wider issues in the sports industry. You started off many years ago in McCain Foods, went to work for some of the biggest brands in sport, Adidas, Nike, Umbro, and then UFC, which is an interesting one I'd like to delve in more. Take us back initially. How did you go from oven chips to one of the biggest brands in sport?
Good afternoon, Tom. Thanks for that introduction. Yeah, it was good that we talked about technical stuff last week, seeing that we're having some technical problems this morning or today on the Zoom webinar. How did I get into it? Well, actually, I've probably been involved in sport all my life. As most of us, when we're growing up as kids, I started out participating. Back in Ireland in the day, it was Gaelic football and hurling, and then football outside of school. Played football to a good level, but was never going to make a career of it. It wasn't going to pay the mortgage, or I wasn't going to get paid any bills. So had to go out there and start figuring out what am I going to do with the rest of my life now that I'm not going to be a professional footballer. So yes, I started with McCain Foods, and in the FMCG industry, fantastic learning and fantastic company to be with. But when I stopped playing football, I gave up for about a year. And then a friend of mine lived around the corner from me, asked me, would I take up refereeing? And I thought, not sure I want to be one of the bad guys. But yeah, I took up refereeing and progressed through a very fast rate refereeing in schoolboy football, amateur football, and then on into the League of Ireland, semi-professional league back home. That got me to the notice of probably a couple of recruiters and different people who saw I was at McCain and saw I was in the sporting world. And an opportunity came up in way back in 1993 to join Adidas and head up the Adidas Ireland office at the time. So I joined the company. Fantastic operation, fantastic organization. And then I moved over to Stockport, to the UK head office. Came over, worked here for a number of years as well, before then getting another call and moving on to Nike out in Holland. And I spent moving back between Holland and the UK, I spent nearly 15 years with the Nike organization. So that's how I came into it. It was from participating in sport, but having a business background and then moving into the sporting world itself.
What was the transition like, going from a huge FMCG brand into one of the biggest brands in sports and equipment? Was there massive cultural differences, or were there a lot of the same principles in place?
It was a massive shock and difference of moving into the business. For me personally, I'd come from an FMCG background, which was very regimented, very professional in its operation, had a great formula to something. If you were going to launch a product, you could basically go over to the cupboard, open the door, and pull out the book that says, here's how you launch this product. Moving into the sporting world, and you got to remember back in the 90s, it was still a very young industry, and it was a very mom and pop industry in terms of sporting goods retailers. So all of those learnings had to come around and come into the business. So it wasn't as professional as it is now. I mean, sport actually leads a lot of the business world now in its own principles and guidelines and practices. So it was a huge cultural shock to, they throw a shoe at you and say, hey, we're going to launch this. And I'd go, where's the manual? Well, you were making up the manual as you were going along. But all those learnings came. And what I've seen over time was that actually a lot more people came from the FMCG industry and other industries, came into the world of sport and brought all those best practices into place as well.
And how much do you feel sport has progressed where we sit now from those days in the 90s? Because I'll give you an example. We deal with a lot of candidates in our executive search practice that are looking to transition into the sports industry. And they find it quite interesting to see where sport is in terms of governance, in terms of commercial operation, marketing. What are your feelings on how it's progressed over the years?
Well, I was reading an article week 10 days ago about the size of the market, and you bring into it whether it's in participation, whether it's in spectators or sporting goods, you bring all of those things in. And they reckon, it was a Business Wire research article that I was reading, and they reckon that the market is worth around $488 billion worldwide this year alone, and growing at a rate of anywhere between 5 and 7%. So it's a huge business, but it's a huge, diverse business. And I think that that's the key to it, that, I want to be in sport. Well, do you want to work for Manchester United or Barcelona, or do you want to go and work for the Olympic organization? Well, there are so many other strings to it now, whether that's esports, whether that's gaming, whether that's in broadcasting, gambling or research, as well as those other tried and tested parts. So I think for people who want to come into this industry, the opportunities are absolutely immense. I've touched on what I believe are kind of categories within that. But if you're working in IT, you can work in any of those divisions. If you're working in brand and marketing or PR, you can work in any of those organizations that give you those opportunities to be involved and in and living the world of sport that you're in. I mean, it's a great place to be. I do remember a funny story, going back to an earlier question. I do remember a funny story that a friend of mine rang me up. I'd been appointed the general manager for Nike football back in 2004, 5-ish. And he rang me up and he said, I just don't get Nike. He said, well, why have they appointed you? And I went, well, thanks very much. Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for the praise. And he said, no, but think about it. He says, every time you get up in the morning, what do? You read about football. And then you go into the office and you talk about football. And then you go and you play football. And then you're watching football and you're going to football. And now they're going to pay you to do all that. So, if you have a love for a sport, or you have a love just for the world of sport and competition, it's a great place to have a career.
And tell us about some of the disciplines that you touched on there, David, how you've encountered those through your career in sports brands like Adidas, Nike, Umbro, and then in the UFC. How do you interact? For example, you've come from a comms and marketing background primarily. How does that interact with commercial, and then in finance, legal, all the other disciplines? How does it all knit together for you?
It's an interesting dynamic in the world of sport, because I think sport is still evolving and growing up. So again, coming back to FMCG, where at the time when I was there, all those functions were in particular silos. And probably the best example I can give to you is when the World Cup in Germany ended in 2006, is when Nike as a business, we decided to actually turn things on its head. We were an organization that was built around 3 big pillars of the business: the footwear side of the business, the apparel side of the business, and then the equipment side. So 3 main functions. And so everything lived in those worlds. We took a different approach coming out of that World Cup to say, well, actually, if you're going to be number one in a sport, in a particular sport, you've got to live, eat, breathe, drink that sport day in, day out. And so we went to what we called at the time a categorical approach to it. And so the world of football, and that's where I was heading up. Good friend of mine, colleague of everybody on VSI, Gary Cook, he did a similar thing over in the US, where he headed up Brand Jordan. And what we did was we had footwear people working in the category. We had apparel people working, we had marketing people. So we operated like a mini company within the big organization. And so bringing all those functions together, they still lived in sales, they still lived in brand, but their myopic focus was on that one particular sport. And that actually changed the appeal and the way that people thought about moving into working for a sporting brand at the time. I think the UFC is a great example of extending all that to another place, because the UFC as a rights holder actually are the pure rights holder. They own everything themselves, whether that's the production of the show that you see, how it's televised, how the events are put on, the operations that come behind that events, how they run their social media. Everything is ingrained and entrenched in that one piece, all leading back up to what the brand is, and the brand is UFC. The brand is not, the Conor McGregors of the world or the Alex Gustavs. The brand is the UFC, and they're very, very particular in how that's presented and shown. And to make sure that it all works in one way, they operate in that category.
Speaking about UFC, because that's a really interesting example of what was a very niche product and sport, if you like. The growth has been enormous over the last 10, 15 years. What are the secrets of their success? How come they've become such an enormous global brand now with mass appeal?
I think there's a couple of things to it. Is that, yes, it was niche, or another way of phrasing it maybe was, it was everybody's dirty little secret. We all loved it, but we didn't tell anybody about it, that we loved it, until we built great superstars. And superstars like the John Jones of the world, or the Conor McGregors of the world, so building their brands. But I think that Lorenzo Fertitta, who founded and owned the company, he used a quote. He said that it was and still is the oldest profession in the world. He says, so you go back to Stone Age man. He said, one guy hits another guy and everybody turns around and watches. That's the basis and the premise of what it's about. And then it was about, okay, how do we build that into a brand, and how do we make that appealing to everybody? So I think during the time that I was there, one of the big things that we had to do in building the brand was educate people about the sport, because there was, and there still is, a little bit of negativity around, two guys or two girls, fighting in the octagon. So it was about teaching people and getting people to understand and educate them around that these are finely tuned athletes. These are masters in their discipline. And the disciplines that they fight in is a mix of all of the different combat sports put together. Again, I've been involved in sport for over 20 odd years. I have never come across athletes as finely tuned as a mixed martial artist. They have to know how to stand up and fight. They have to know how to be on the ground and fight. Their training that they put in, everything that they do is absolutely exceptional. So it was a big job of building the brand with the people who influence what consumers will go and look at. And that's the journalists and the media, and getting people to really understand that this is a pure sport in its finest way that you can absolutely think about. And these guys and girls are working harder and harder than any other athlete around the world. So educating them, that was the first thing. I think then bringing and educating people on the safety aspects of the sport, and understanding that there are rules, there are regulations, there are different things. And, you can play football, you could break a leg, you could play rugby, you get a concussion, you can play any sport, and there's an element of risk. You're fighting in mixed martial arts, yes, there's an element of risk. But I think it was educating them. And then educating people on the mutual respect of the athletes. Although they get in there for, 5-minute rounds and, they inflict damage on one another, the absolute respect from one athlete to the other is something I've never seen in any other sport ever. It's amazing. So it's taking all those elements of the product, putting it together with what the UFC stood for, and taking that brand and educating people, bringing it to different markets, bringing it, and getting brand ambassadors behind you. And it's not just entertainment, it is an actual sport. And I think that was a big part of the job that we had at the time. And now it's not everybody's dirty little secret. Everybody loves to say, yeah, I watched the UFC last night.
So in principle, and I joked at the start about going from oven chips to sporting goods, but broad terms from what you're saying, oven chips, trainers, sports equipment, or a product or an event like UFC, the same principles apply?
Absolutely, the same principles. I think you got to start with one thing, and again, I learned this in my time at Nike, and it's the chip in the back of my neck. It starts and ends with the athlete. That's who you develop a product for, and that product could be a shoe. That product could be the Octagon. That product could be a piece of apparel. It starts and ends with the athlete. And then alongside that is, who's your consumer? Who are you talking to? Who do you want to bring the message to? And how do you want to deliver that message? So it's all about the branding of your product, your event, your consumer, the athlete. It's bringing all of those things together. So I wouldn't recommend that you eat too many McCain chips if you want to try and be a fighter in the UFC. So that I'm not sure they come along together, but the business principles behind it are absolutely there. Yes. You must say, sorry, Tom, you must have seen that in building businesses when you were at cricket as an example.
Yeah, obviously cricket, looking at county cricket, that's had to go through a real transition from my time in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s, when it was very traditional membership driven. I went through the initiation of 2020, which was the first major piece of market research ever done in the sport. And look what that led to with the initial success at county level, and now looking at IPL and international level. And that was based on solid market research, which was a real anathema to sport in those days. But now most major sports are looking at how they can package their product to make it relevant to mass audiences, particularly as now we're ever more probably cash rich, time poor, perhaps a poor analogy at the moment, but that's been the trend over recent years. And the availability of so many platforms to get your product out to market. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's about figuring out what your market is. I mean, I talked about that $488 billion business, but you bring it down and down and down. 50% of that global market is based in the US. So do you want to focus yourself on the US? You come to the UK and there's over 600,000 people employed in the sport of business in the UK. So again, you're bringing it down and down and down to focus on who is that consumer, who do I really want to talk to, who's the core of that target market that I'm operating within. And then other people will hear the noise and other people will hear the message as you're going along, but it's been myopic in your focus, myopic in what you want to do. But I also think, whether it was my Nike days or my UFC days, and the Nike slogan of just do it and taking risks, I think applies across all sports, because if everybody's copying the same thing and not taking some risks along the way, and I know that's difficult in today's world where we're all sitting at home to try and think, well, what's risks? But business risks, sporting risks, doing things differently that will bring those those consumers and those viewers along with you.
How did you apply your skills and experience from your early career into a sports career? How did you manage that transition?
I think the first big thing for me was around team management, and that actually came. A lot of my learning and education came from being on the field of play, because I'm the one guy standing there as a referee in black, and all other of the 22 people on the pitch had a point of view on what my decision was. So it was understanding how to manage those guys at the time, how to manage those guys in a highly volatile atmosphere, in a very competitive atmosphere, in a not a win at all costs, but a winning mentality all of those players have. So understanding how you can manage and team manage those people. And I was able to take some of that from the field of play into the world of sport. Because I think, people working in the world of sport have that winning attitude as well. Have that competitive set that the athlete has in that world of sport. I think the great thing about, and one of the things that I've learned over time also, is that as in any sport or any competition, you actually don't know the end result till the final whistle goes or the person passes the finishing line and breaks the tape. Nobody knows what the end result is. So it's actually all right if you don't win and you make mistakes, as long as you learn from them. And I think they were the two big things for me, that the team management, give stuff a go. If you don't get it right, have a look back, figure out what it was you did right or wrong, and then move on to the next thing. I think they'd be two big principles from me.
I often tell people, David, that the hardest job to get in the sports industry is the first one. Did you find that the case? And once you're in, how did you manage your career progression?
You'll read about it everywhere. You'll hear it all over LinkedIn. You'll hear it through VSI programs. Networking. And it's not so much networking and making it, that's the only thing you do. If you don't enjoy it, or you don't like being with people, or you don't like being around the world of sport, well, then it's probably not for you. But getting out there and talking to other people who work in the business, there may be people that work in sports marketing as a function. That may not be for you, but having a coffee or going and introducing yourself to those people and understanding that this is a great place to be, you'll start to learn things. You never know the opportunity that will come down the road then a number of years later or a number of months later. It can be a long road. I think one of the things that that's harder for a lot of athletes who have spent the majority of their young life in the world of sport, and then say they want to work in sport, don't really know what that means. What does it mean to work in the world of sport? Do they want to work in digital? Do they want to be in brand? Do they want to be on the commercial side? And I think the onus is on companies, and I've done this in my time when I was working with Oprah. We brought in a number of rugby players who would work for us for a day a week. They do it over a 6-month period, and we'd spread them around all the different functions within the operation. We did it last year with 2 of the GB hockey players, one of the men's, one of the women's as well. And it just opened those guys' eyes to, I don't want to go there, but I could go over here. So I think finding your own way of getting into the world of sport, and you and I, Tom, have lived in the world of sport for so long. We just love talking about sport. We love talking about, what happened last night on TV. Didn't happen last night, but you know what I mean. What happened on the TV, about the game, the upcoming game. People love, within the world and the business of sport, talking about sport. So it's not really that hard to network.
Final question, David. Obviously, you've had a diverse and varied career. 2 elements to the question. Best experience you can recall, and the one decision that you really regret.
Oh my God. The best was toying with that. We hadn't prepared this one, Tom. The best one was Manchester United versus Barcelona, neither of them my team, in Rome in the Champions League final. And it was at a time when I was working with a colleague of mine, Paddy Muldoon. Paddy headed up the sportswear category within Nike, and I headed up football. And it's a small thing, but it's a big thing in my world. We had the two teams walk out onto the pitch. They were wearing the best jerseys, the best boots that we could provide from a performance point of view. But the teams walked out wearing an N98, which is a jacket, which was a sportswear jacket. And they were wearing and standing in a line. It seems a small thing, but to get the world of sport to understand that we were trying to do that crossover at that point in time of taking something from the pitch to the street and taking the street back to the pitch was just something that blew people's mind. I put a tick to Paddy on my CV, if you like, for that one. So that's probably one of the highlights of my career. Lowlights, a disappointment rather than a low light. How about I go that way? There was an athlete that was a Nike sponsored athlete at the time, and he was doing some great things in the world of cancer and cancer research. And he came up with this little wristband, a yellow wristband, and it was Live Strong. And I was one of the ones alongside a bigger team that launched that whole initiative right across around the world. And we raised millions and millions and millions of dollars for the charity that was set up behind it, the Live Strong charity. What a disappointment when it was found out that the story that we all know around Lance Armstrong now. That was a big disappointment for me. I had two of his books in the house, and they were both signed by him to me. They're gone.
Excellent, David. That's a really fascinating insight. I'll throw it over to Tim for any questions that we've received in from the viewers.
Yeah, cheers, Tom. Really insightful, Dave. Always. Just a question going back on to some of the things we were talking about before, learning from some of the mistakes and not being afraid to make some of those mistakes. One of the things that we've picked up from the Grandmaster of Football, as we like to call him now, is that to review the situation when things are going really well. When you had a really good game and everything's gone for you, it's just as important to sit and review if you're constantly looking for development improvements. How would that fit in your operational model if you were back in the seat at UFC right now?
Well, great question, and I think it's as important to look at when you're doing right as to when you're doing not so well. Let's put it that way. You've always got to analyze, and you've got to figure out, well, even if you've won, how did you win, and how can you improve? Because somebody's going to come behind you. You know, we all talk about the Daley Thompson piece when he was the greatest athlete in the world in the decathlon. And we know the story. He was training on Christmas Day because his competitor wasn't. So you've got to figure out those things to do right. I think also you can overthink things as well. Tom Peters, the business guru, he wrote a line one time, and I always remember it. This is going back even before my sporting days, back in my McCain days. And it was all around ready, fire, aim. So switching the last two words around, it was, if you're ready, go for it, then analyze. Now, you may have hit the target when you're fired, or you may have missed the target when you're fired, but do the analysis afterwards. That's probably, Tim, the best answer I can give you to that one.
That's a great answer. Just building on just talking about UFC. In your opinion, what are your thoughts on how they've attempted to host some of the events during this pandemic? And that's from Gio in Russia.
Very interesting one. I'm a big friend of Dana White, and I'm a big supporter of everything that Dana does for the UFC and has done for 20 odd years. I think when he came out and he said, and I'm a little bit removed from it, so take a pinch of salt. This is a personal opinion. When he said he was going to do it on an island, the first thing that came to my mind was that could be all right. There must be or could be somewhere in the world, may have got it wrong, must be somewhere in the world where it'll be okay to do it. Second thoughts were then about the safety of the employees and his team members and how was he going to do all that. And he came out with a whole big plan around how he could get it done. So we're all starved of sport. Everybody in the world is starved of sport. So from a commercial and a business perspective, we'd all have paid to watch. It's a no-brainer. But it's not a no-brainer when it comes to the safety of the employees, the athletes, and the wider community. So I think somebody at Disney, as Dana said, the powers to be at Disney said, maybe not such a good idea. So they moved away from it. But I do see even breaking news this morning that WWE have been given an exemption in Florida because it's an essential business. I'll leave that up to everybody else to figure out whether WWE is an essential business.
Well, if it's classed as sport, entertainment, whatever you want to call it, I think we're all missing that void right now. So yeah, we're finding ways to kind of fit it in. Even two flies running up a window is beginning to look interesting at the moment. I think this next one is actually a build on from Karen in the UK. She says, "What are the opportunities and the benefits of sport coming out of this crisis?"
I think the benefits are the same as what the benefits were when we started out. There's the physical and mental benefits of participating in sport. There's, for you as an individual, how you behave, how it interacts, how your physical well-being is as an individual. I think the big part will come around community, and volunteering. I think the social aspect of sport, whether it's young kids, whether it's yourself, whether it's mass participation events, mass participation runs, marathons, whatever it is. I think sport will bring everybody back together. Another quote, Richard Ayres, pal of mine over at Seven League, Richard reminded me of a quote in a blog he wrote a couple of weeks ago. It was Nelson Mandela when he was given the 2000 Laureus Award for sport, and the first person ever. I wrote it down so that I don't mess it up. And Nelson Mandela said, "Sport has the power to change the world, to inspire and to unite people and to create hope." I can't answer better than that.
No, not at all. I think that's a classic quote. That's going to live long into the next couple of centuries, I guess. For those of us that love sport and what we do, I think that's probably it round about the questions that we've got right now. So thanks again. Thank you for being on the spot. I know Tom threw a couple of curveballs at you, as he does. So I'm going to hand back over to Mr. Faulkner, just to kind of wrap things up and take it from there. But thank you very much again. Really appreciate it, Dave.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
David, as always, thanks for your time. Another insightful discussion into your career to date and the general wider opportunities that are available in sport, which as you mentioned, I don't think everyone sees directly. But it was good for you to touch on that and to explain that in a little more detail. So thanks for your time over these last two sessions. They've been informative and insightful. Next week, we're going to be speaking to father and son, Josh and Bill Beaumont from the world of rugby union, who are going to be discussing some of the opportunities and the challenges that the world of rugby is facing at this moment in time. So until then, guys, stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all next week. Thanks very much.
I'll read that.